In the last video, we explored the design of an Act of Parliament. In this video, we will be using the Healthcare Services Blood Banking Service Regulations 2021 to illustrate the structure and terminologies that make up a typical piece of subsidiary legislation. To recap, subsidiary legislation are delegated legislation. We learnt that subsidiary legislation is made using a law-making power delegated by the legislature. First, because parliamentary time is limited, the legislature delegates its law-making powers usually to ministers and statutory bodies. Second, laws made under these delegated law-making powers are called subsidiary legislation. Third, any subsidiary legislation made must be within the scope authorized by the Act. Finally, subsidiary legislation can take many forms or types. The Healthcare Services Act 2020 is the parent act of this subsidiary legislation. The parent act's name or title usually appears at the top of the subsidiary legislation. The title of the subsidiary legislation appears after the parent act's title. The title of a subsidiary legislation usually has the short title of the parent act as its prefix, followed by a succinct description of the subject matter of the subsidiary legislation, followed by the form of the subsidiary legislation, followed by the year of its publication. Every subsidiary legislation will be assigned a number when it is published in the Government Gazette. This is numbered sequentially in a year and chronologically according to the date that it is published. This is the enactment clause, which identifies, first, the authority under which the subsidiary legislation is made. In this case, Section 57 of the Healthcare Services Act 2020. And second, the person who made the subsidiary legislation, in this case, the Minister for Health. How we refer to a main provision in a subsidiary legislation depends on the form or type of subsidiary legislation. Since this subsidiary legislation is in the form of regulations, each provision is called a regulation. The first provision, in this case, Regulation 1, will declare the title of the subsidiary legislation and also indicate when the subsidiary legislation comes into force. If no operative date is stated, the subsidiary legislation comes into force on the date that it is published in the Government Gazette. Generally, subsidiary legislation continues to be in force until it is revoked by another subsidiary legislation or an act. Rarely, the first provision may also state how long the subsidiary legislation remains in force. Like acts, the second provision of a subsidiary legislation usually contains definitions of the terms used in the subsidiary legislation. In addition, definitions in the parent act will generally apply to the subsidiary legislation and are thus not repeated in the subsidiary legislation. For example, the term license used in Regulation 4 is defined in Section 2, Subsection 1 of the Healthcare Services Act 2020. It is therefore important to be familiar with the parent act when reading its subsidiary legislation. Like acts, some subsidiary legislation may also be divided into parts and divisions within a part. Each provision is numbered sequentially and has a heading that is a brief description of the provision's contents. The heading of Regulation 12 indicates that the provision relates to the recruitment and evaluation of donors. Where a number appears within brackets, it is called a paragraph if the subsidiary legislation takes the form of bylaws, regulations, or rules, or a subparagraph if the subsidiary legislation takes the form of a notification or an order. Where a lowercase letter, small Roman numeral, or uppercase letter appears within brackets, it is called a subparagraph. This is a PLUS Project initiative brought to you by the Legislation Division of the Attorney General's Chambers.